What used to be considered merely child's play has now evolved into a multi-billion-dollar industry, competing with and even surpassing established media like sports and movies. Today, we'll begin a 6-part series on the history of video games, starting with the beginning of history itself and going all the way up until the 1970s. When it comes to this video, we're not going to be discussing actual games as much as we will in some other entries into this series. Rather, we're going to be setting up the context for how video games came to be. We'll start with the history of humans playing games of all kinds. Then we'll discuss how pinball changed the idea of playing games in a public space, the arcade. After that, we'll talk about how Sega pushed the envelope of what all of these arcade games could be in a technical way. And then we'll talk about Atari, how they took the arcade and put video games into it, starting a revolution with their now legendary Pong. And to end this video, we'll discuss the very first video game console and just what video games were like in the 1970s. At the end of this video, you'll have a general understanding of the foundation of video games and just what the industry was like in its early formative years. So let's get into it. I'm Jack, and this is Timeless Headlines.
And now for something completely different.
Competition between humans, both in groups and individually, is well documented and well understood. The very first evidence of a game being played between one another comes from 5870 BC in what is today Jordan. The game in question resembles one still enjoyed today, Bow. Much like Go, chess, and checkers, the objective of this game was to capture all of your opponent's pieces in a turn-based system. Moving forward to the 12th century, when an English chronicler, Roger of Howden, wrote that medieval European tournaments were, quote, military exercises, carried out not in the spirit of hostility, but solely for practice and display of prowess. With how nasty, brutish, and short life was in the past, it is no wonder that people turned to games to pass their time. Games as a distraction was a good way to relieve tension, but it was also a great way to build skills that would be necessary for survival later on. Gambling, sports, and drunken games amongst friends all have provided people, since time immemorial, with an escape from their day-to-day. And one such escape, pinball, would provide the very foundation for the video game industry that we now know. As with any good story, video games have a surprising start in a familiar place. And that place is pinball. Pinball can trace its roots back to another game called bagatelle, which itself was a form of billiards. The game of bagatelle, which had developed and changed over time, would enjoy a huge surge in popularity in the early and middle 19th century. This game was played in community spaces, think pool halls, and as the urban population grew, its popularity grew with it. The 1800s would give way to the Industrial Revolution, where bagatelle would evolve into the modern-day game of billiards. And as the Industrial Revolution gave way to the 1900s, and eventually the 1930s, the game of pool became more mechanized. In 1931, David Gottlieb swapped out the cue for the mechanized arms and mass-produced his pool-esque game of Baffle Ball. The game was well on its way to becoming modern-day pinball, and even had a mechanism to detect tilt, what he would call body English. Body English. Body English. The machine wasn't overly sophisticated, but it was something different, which in Great Depression America, people badly needed. It was largely spring-loaded, which means it wasn't sophisticated in the way that it used electronics, but it was cheap and it was easy to play, and that's why it was successful. In 1937, Harry Williams would develop his own version of Gottlieb's machine, but the key difference here is that he would electrify it. This electrification would allow for a more powerful and elegant design, and included a metal ball that would be shot from spring-loaded arms, and thus the first true pinball machine was made. These machines, which would be built by various manufacturers across the US and UK, were a great distraction from the Great Depression. They quickly gained popularity for their affordability and ease of use. As such, vast distribution networks were created to get them in front of consumers. As pinball's popularity grew, the distribution networks only became bigger, and at the start of World War II, a salesman who worked for one such distributor would help bridge the gap between pinball and video games. Erwin Bromberg was a successful pinball salesman throughout the 30s, and leading all the way up to the start of World War II. Bromberg's company, Standard Games, pivoted from selling pinball machines to arcades to selling them to the US military bases in the Pacific Theater. When the war ended, Bromberg's son would take over and began to focus more and more on the Japanese market. With an already substantial footprint, it was only natural that he would focus on US military bases and expand from there. Now, why would Standard Games focus on the Japanese market if the US economy was bigger than the entire rest of the world's put together? At the end of the war, the arcade and pinball machine business had become considerably stagnant. Arcades only had so much floor space, so rather than expand the number of games they had, and therefore expand the square footage they occupied, they would take the more rational approach of trading in their older games for credit for newer ones. But it eventually led to a glut of inventory in coin-operated machine and pinball machine manufacturers' warehouses. The opening of the Japanese market offered a unique opportunity for American manufacturers to reduce their inventory. Pinball was still quite popular, but the coin-operated gaming industry was beginning to diversify, and they were beginning to offer different types of games. Now, what were these games like that weren't pinball, that were in arcades at this time? They can be generally understood as mechanized carnival games. They used lights and springs and basic calculators to keep track of both the score and the duration of the game. By the 1950s, Standard Games had established itself as the preeminent game manufacturer in the world. And by the 1950s, it had started doing business under a different name, one that might sound a little bit more familiar today: Sega. Sega! It is at this point that Sega became a victim of its own success, as it became increasingly scrutinized by both the American and Japanese governments. It was accused of a laundry list of crimes, ranging from tax evasion to straight-up bribery and coercion. And while Sega fought these allegations long and hard, its days as the original American iteration of the company were numbered.
We fucked up.
On May 31st, 1960, Service Games Japan ceased to exist and was broken into two subsidiaries, one of which would continue to do business as Sega Inc. and would eventually buy out the majority of its Japanese competition, along with the remaining assets of Service Games. The new, exclusively Japanese-owned Sega Inc. was allowed to continue doing business under two conditions. First, they could not sell to US military bases, and second, they had to cease all operations of all of their electronically operated gambling machines. At this point, that had become a significant part of their business, and if you've ever looked at a slot machine and a pinball machine, you could kind of get an understanding why. This is a very significant moment, as it marks the Japanese entry into an industry which, up until that point, had been dominated by American companies. Even today, the two biggest markets for and producers of video games are the United States and Japan. And another reason this is significant? This gave Japanese engineers a chance to operate under their own discretion and show off their ingenuity. This ingenuity would culminate in Sega releasing Periscope in 1966 in Japan, which would mark the beginning of the digital age in the arcade. Now, the reason I use the word digital and not video is because this isn't what we would consider a true video game. As you can see, the game is fairly mechanical, but it was significantly more sophisticated than the average arcade game was at the time. It also standardized the quarter cost that all arcade games would eventually adopt. The game was so popular in its home market that Sega began to export it. By the beginning of 1969, Sega's Periscope would be in arcades all across America. This game would show the public and manufacturers alike how sophisticated technologies could be put into a single machine. Sega and other manufacturers would contribute to a bustling arcade culture that would only grow throughout the 1960s. These arcades would be populated largely by young men in Japan and the West. These arcades and their games had a profound cultural impact, whether they were pinball or something else. The pop culture success was such that The Who even released the song Pinball Wizard in 1969. These young men of the baby boomer generation used arcades as a distraction from both their families and the anxieties of the Cold War. And in a story that will ring true with Bagatelle, with coin-operated machines all the way up until the late 1960s, games were a distraction, and it was cheap and it was fun. But while Sega continued to grow the established aspect of the arcade business, the first video games were only just being made. There was one game that would make video games mainstream, and in 1972, Atari's Pong was just that game. While arcades and the games they had cemented their cultural status, computers were just now starting to become mainstream, as in the late 60s and early 1970s, they were beginning to make quantum leaps in computer power. To give an example of that, the Colossus computer used by the Allies during the D-Day invasion was the size of a VW Beetle. An iPhone 13 has roughly 1 million times that processing power. Prior to Pong, video games were not accessible to the masses. Space War, while not commercially successful, was the first true video game. However, it needed the most powerful computer available in the world at the time just to be played, which meant that only computer scientists had access to it. One such computer scientist, Nolan Bushnell, loved the game so much that he would sneak into Stanford's computer lab just to play the game. Bushnell and his close friend Ted Dabney would go on to make their own computers at home because they just wanted to play the game that much. When the two of them realized the commercial potential of what they had made, they contacted a Chicago-based coin-operated machine manufacturer. This manufacturer, the Nutting Corporation, had seen Sega's Periscope and wanted to stay competitive with their Japanese counterparts, hence why we brought that up earlier. So between Atari needing a manufacturer to mass produce their game and the Nutting Corporation wanting to stay competitive in the arcade space, this was a marriage of opportunity. Atari's first game, produced by the Nutting Corporation, was called Computer Space, which was Atari's version of Space War. Naturally, Bushnell would put the first unit ever produced in the bar that was frequented by Stanford's computer science students. Computer Space would go on to be a modest success as it grew gradually across arcades throughout the US. It would do roughly $26.7 million in sales in today's money. It wasn't their first game that changed everything, it was their second. Following 1971's Computer Space, Atari now had more capital and a reputation that they could stand on, so naturally they expanded and hired more engineers. One of these engineers, Alan Alcorn, was given a training exercise to create a game. When Alcorn showed what he made to Bushnell and Dabney, they were amazed, both with its simplicity and its elegance. The truly remarkable thing is that Pong, even in its original form, doesn't need to be translated, changed, or altered in any way for people all around the world to enjoy. In 1972, Bushnell put the first unit of Pong next to the very first unit of Computer Space in the same bar, and before too long, they were receiving more orders than they could fill. Simply put, and without a doubt, Pong is the first commercially successful video game. Its cultural impact cannot be understated. This game is so iconic that people in their 50s and 60s will still light up about their very first memories of playing it to this day.
To this day! To this day!
There is no doubt that Pong heralded the dawn of the age of video games, but it wasn't the only revolution in the space in 1972. The same year Pong would come out would be the year that the first home video game console would be released. Everyone knows what Pong is, but the same cannot be said for the Magnavox Odyssey. And again, while not as well known and also being released in 1972, it was just as revolutionary. It was the very first video game home console, and it came with 11 games that were more or less different iterations of Pong. Now, when you look at footage of this console, especially from its first advertisement, it is incredibly basic by today's standards. But when you realize that as the making of this video, this system is already 52 years old, it's pretty remarkable to think that that was even a concept back in 1972. It should be pointed out that the Odyssey didn't do much in the way of generating graphics. In fact, the majority of the graphics per se were a see-through filter you would drape over the TV. And it is widely acknowledged that the Odyssey did not come anywhere close to the cultural impact of Pong, due in a large part to a lackluster marketing campaign. Now, why do we remember Pong and we don't remember the Magnavox Odyssey, even though they're both pretty remarkable for the era that they came from? Well, it's pretty straightforward in my opinion. Pong was the natural continuation of a cultural phenomenon. We went from pool halls to arcades to video game arcades. And it was presented like it was what it was. The Magnavox Odyssey was largely marketed like another board game or a child's toy. It wasn't treated as it was something truly revolutionary. And because of that, we don't remember it nearly as much as we remember Pong. Magnavox would eventually sue Atari, as they would claim Pong was too similar to the games that they offered. But this wouldn't do anything to stop the Odyssey's eventual slide into complete irrelevance. To give credit where credit is due, the Odyssey did show that you could sell a home console, and at least some people would buy it. Atari would release their own home console, named Home Pong, their own home video game console in 1975. Home Pong was only the beginning in an Atari cavalcade of Pong titles that were released. Super Pong, Ultra Pong Doubles, Pong Pro Chef, Pong Cars, Pong 2, Revenge of the Pong. Would you like Pong with that? Dude, where's my Pong? Super Pong, Pro-Am, Super Pong, Pro-Am 10, Super Pong 10, no Pro-Am, Super Pong Pro-Am Box.
Boy, that escalated quickly. I mean, that really got out of hand fast.
You get the idea. Nintendo, yes, that Nintendo, even ended up getting in on the action by releasing their very successful color TV game 6 and 15 in 1977. The numbers corresponded to how many games you could play. They were first released in Japan and then later in the United States. The late 1970s were an interesting time for video games, indeed. Companies treated the early years of the video game industry very similarly to how companies treat board games. They released several highly similar copycat games and consoles with little to differentiate them. Some may still have their favorite games from the 70s. The overwhelming majority of the games released weren't trying to innovate or push the envelope in any significant way, as they were just trying to cash in on the video game craze of the time. And in a sign of the times that showed just how corporatized and standardized the industry had become, the once unheard of startup Atari was bought by Time Warner in 1976. And the following year, they would go on to release their home console, the Atari 2600. Meanwhile, Japan largely suffered from the same problem. There were too many titles that had too much in common with one another. With the exception of Glacian and Asteroids, both released in 1979, many of the games of the 1970s, and especially the late 70s, lacked innovation. This was due to a combination of technological constraints of the era and a lack of vision from leaders of this new industry. Even with a new console from an established player who pioneered the space, there was little innovation in terms of game design with the home console. The arcade video game scene, which was significantly larger in terms of sales, was absolutely no different. So many games look so similar from this era. The biggest contributions of the 1970s in terms of video games was to establish the industry itself and show that there was a mass market in and outside of the home. However, due to an increasingly large catalog of highly repetitive and similar games, the industry would suffer problems that wouldn't manifest truly for years to come. The problems of oversaturation and oversupply wouldn't truly show themselves until the 1980s. But in order to discuss that, we'll have to wait for part 2. Thank you so much for watching. This has been part 1 of our 6-part series on the history of video games. Wanted to get this out a little bit sooner, but in making a video on video games, I played way too many video games. Helldivers 2, talk about that in a later video. But again, just really appreciate the support for this channel. We're just getting started. first video already has 114,000 views, which is amazing. Thank you, everybody. So any bit of support you can give this channel, whether it's on Patreon or just liking, subscribing, whatever that is, we really appreciate it. We're gonna try to come out with more videos moving forward. But again, just thank you so much. Hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one. I'm Jack, and this has been Timeless Headlines.